She didn't cry when her father sold her future to a stranger. She saved her tears for later, when no one could use them against her. Lenora Ashby was 20 years old when her father knocked on her door and told her she was getting married in 3 days to a man she'd never spoken to, in a valley she'd never seen, with no way back through the mountains once the snow came. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She packed one bag, buttoned her coat, and made herself a single promise: survive this. What she never expected, what no one warned her about, was that the most dangerous thing waiting for her in Grey Hollow wasn't the winter. It was the man who never once tried to own her. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay till the end and let's find out together. The wagon smelled like wet canvas and old rope, and Lenora had been sitting in it for 6 hours with her back straight and her jaw tight and her hands folded in her lap like she was on her way to church instead of being handed off to a man she'd never laid eyes on. Her father, Edmund Ashby, sat across from her. He hadn't spoken since they crossed the ridge. He kept looking out at the tree line, at the gray sky pressing down on the mountains, at anything that wasn't his daughter's face. She didn't make it easier for him. She stared right at him, steady and unblinking, the way her mother used to when she wanted Edmund to feel the full weight of what he'd done. Lenora had learned that from watching her mother. She'd learned a lot of things from watching her mother, mostly what it looked like when a woman stopped hoping. "You'll be comfortable there," Edmund said finally, without turning from the window. "Silas Boone is a good man, steady. He provides." "You've met him twice," Lenora said. "3 times. 3 times. She let that sit between them. "And that's enough to know what kind of man he is." Edmund shifted in his seat. He had the look he always got when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. "The harvest failed, Lenora. The debts are... It's not a small thing. The Hendersons are already talking about taking the property. Your sisters are still young. If I lose the farm..." "I know why you did it," she said, quiet, flat. "I'm not asking you why. I'm asking you to say it plain. Say that you traded me." The wagon hit a rut. Edmund grabbed the side panel. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the first few flakes of early snow were beginning to drift through the pines. He never said it plain. He never did. Grey Hollow wasn't what she'd imagined, though she hadn't let herself imagine much. It was a clutch of maybe 30 structures pressed into the floor of a narrow mountain valley. Log cabins, a trading post, a smokehouse, a mill that had seen better decades. The kind of place that didn't appear on any map she'd ever seen in school, which meant it was the kind of place that existed entirely on its own terms. People stopped what they were doing when the wagon rolled in. A woman beating a rug paused mid-swing and watched. 2 men hauling timber set down their load. A group of children who'd been chasing each other through the mud stopped dead, suddenly fascinated. Lenora felt every one of those eyes like a finger poking between her shoulder blades. The new wife, those looks said. Boone's wife. She held her chin up. She was good at that. The wagon stopped outside a cabin set slightly apart from the rest. Not the largest in the hollow, but solid. The kind of structure built by someone who cared more about whether the walls would hold than whether they looked impressive. 2 windows. A covered porch with a single wooden chair. Firewood stacked so high and even along the side wall it looked almost architectural. Edmund climbed down first and helped her out, though she didn't need the help and they both knew it. The door opened before they reached it. Silas Boone was taller than she'd expected. That was the first thing she registered. The height, and then the stillness. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and no particular expression on his face, just watching her come up the path with the same calm attention a man might give to weather he was trying to read. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed. Dark hair that needed cutting. A jaw that carried several days of beard. His coat was worn but well-maintained, but patched at one elbow with a slightly different leather, the stitching careful and tight. His hands, resting at his sides, were large and scarred in the small specific ways that came from years of working rope and blade and cold. He wasn't ugly. She noticed that with something close to resentment. It would have been easier if he were ugly. "Miss Ashby, he said. It'll be Mrs. Boone by tomorrow, from what I'm told, she said. You might as well start there. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, more like a person deciding not to flinch. Lenora, then, he said, if that suits. It'll do. The ceremony the next morning was brief to the point of being almost insulting. A traveling man of some vague official capacity read words from a worn leather book while Edmund stood with his hat in his hands, and a woman named Ruth Calloway, who seemed to be Gray Hollow's version of a neighbor who knows everyone, dabbed at her eyes like this was romantic rather than transactional. Lenora said the words she was supposed to say. Silas said his. Neither of them looked at the other during the vows, which somehow felt more honest than the alternative. Afterward, Edmund pulled her aside while Silas spoke quietly with the official man. I'll come back in spring, Edmund said, when the pass opens. Will you? Lenora? Go home, Papa. She looked at him steadily. Go take care of the girls. That's what this was for. He left before noon. She watched the wagon disappear back up the road toward the pass and felt the mountains close behind it like a door swinging shut. The snow that had been flirting with the valley for days began to fall in earnest, soft and indifferent, covering the wagon tracks almost immediately. She was here now. That was the fact of it. She turned around and walked back to the cabin. The first week was an exercise in structured avoidance. They were polite to each other the way two people are polite when they're both very carefully not saying what they're thinking. Silas cooked, simply, without fuss, meals that were filling without being particularly interesting. Lenora washed dishes and swept floors and organized the small space with a methodical energy that had more to do with needing something to control than actual housekeeping enthusiasm. The cabin had one bedroom, one real bed, a sturdy frame with a mattress that smelled faintly of pine and dried lavender, which struck her as unexpectedly thoughtful given the rough edges of everything else. The first night, she'd stood in the bedroom doorway and stared at the bed for a long moment, her whole body rigid with a kind of preemptive resistance she'd been carrying since the wagon ride. She heard Silas moving around in the main room, the soft drag of something across the floor, the creak of wood. Then quiet. She crept back out and found him lying beside the iron stove, a bedroll spread on the hard floor, one arm folded under his head as a pillow, his coat pulled over him like a blanket. The fire crackled. He had his eyes closed, but she could tell from the quality of his breathing that he wasn't asleep yet. She stood there for a moment, not sure what to do with this. The floor's going to be cold, she said. Floor's fine, he said, without opening his eyes. She stopped. Rearranged what she'd been about to say. The bed is more than large enough for Lenora. He opened his eyes then and looked at her directly, and there was nothing uncomfortable or loaded in his expression, just a plain matter-of-fact steadiness. The bedroom's yours. Get some sleep. We've got a lot of work tomorrow. She wanted to argue, and then she didn't want to argue, and then she went to bed and lay awake for an hour staring at the low ceiling and trying to figure out what kind of man she was actually dealing with. The thing about Gray Hollow was that it didn't give anyone much time to think. There was always something that needed doing. Wood to split and carry, animals to tend, the root cellar to check and organize, water to haul from the creek before it froze over in the mornings. The community itself operated on an informal system of mutual labor. If someone's fence post came down, 3 neighbors showed up to fix it, and those 3 neighbors could count on the same in return. Nothing was written down. Everyone just knew. Lenora learned this by watching, which was her preferred method of learning anything. She also learned things about Silas by watching, though he made it difficult. He was not the kind of man who explained himself. 4 days after the marriage, she saw him split and stack an entire cord of wood for old Caleb Marsh, a widower 2 cabins down whose hands had gone stiff with some joint ailment that made gripping an axe handle near impossible. Silas did it before sunrise, before Caleb was even awake, and was gone before anyone saw him. Lenora only knew because she'd been up early herself, unable to sleep, and caught the sound of the axe in the still cold air. She watched from the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the bite of the morning. He never mentioned it. Not that day, not later. Caleb Marsh brought over a jar of apple preserves that afternoon, looking quietly moved in that stoic way of older men, and Silas accepted it without any ceremony and said the preserves would be good with the venison he was planning. That was it. She filed this away, alongside the other things she was filing. The way he always left the warmest spot near the fire for her without commenting on it. The way he'd quietly resupplied her sewing basket one morning with thread and needles she hadn't asked for, but had clearly been running low on. The way he said goodnight from the floor beside the stove every evening, completely without resentment or pointed silence, as if the arrangement was simply what it was and not a comment on anything. She didn't trust it yet. She wasn't built to trust things quickly, but she was paying attention. The settlement's social life, such as it was, centered on Ruth Calloway's kitchen on Sunday afternoons. Ruth was 50-something, built like a woman who'd been carrying heavy things her whole life, with a laugh like a door with a loose hinge and a warm, blunt manner that Lenora found oddly comforting after the walking on eggshells quality of her father's house. "So," Ruth said, handing Lenora a cup of something hot that turned out to be mostly bark tea with the faintest suggestion of actual tea in it. "How are you finding married life?" "I've been married 8 days," Lenora said. "Plenty of time to form an opinion." Lenora turned the cup in her hands. Around them, the kitchen was filled with women from the settlement, conversations overlapping, someone's baby being passed around, 2 older women playing cards in the corner with focused intensity. She searched for the right word and couldn't find one that felt accurate. "Quiet," she settled on. "That he is." Ruth sat down across from her. Half the men in this valley talk twice as much and say a quarter as much as Silas Boone. Always been that way since he came through here. What was it, 6, 7 years back? She paused, as if deciding something. "He hasn't told you much about himself, has he?" "No." Ruth nodded slowly, without offering to fill the gap, which told Lenora that Ruth knew more than she was saying, which meant there was more to know. She stored that away too. "People trust him," Lenora said. Partly a statement, partly a question. "More than most." Ruth tilted her head. "You know what people trust in Grey Hollow? Consistency. Out here, a man who shows up the same way every day in good weather and bad, that's more valuable than charm or big talk. Silas has never once been something other than exactly what he appears to be." She paused. "Whether that's reassuring or unsettling depends on the person, I suppose." Lenora thought about the axe splitting wood in the cold dark before dawn. She thought about thread and needles she hadn't asked for. "Both," she said honestly. Ruth's loose-hinged laugh filled the kitchen. He came back from a 3-day trapping expedition in late October with frost in his beard and a deep gash along his left forearm that he'd wrapped himself with what appeared to be his own torn shirt, the bandage gone stiff with dried blood. Lenora saw it when he hung up his coat, the sleeve pulling back, the crude wrapping. "Sit down," she said. "It's fine." "I didn't ask if it was fine. Sit down." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. A small recalibration, like he was adjusting to a version of her he hadn't seen yet. He sat. She'd grown up the oldest of 4 children in a house where her mother got sick and never fully got better, which meant Lenora had been the one binding cuts and drawing splinters and talking younger sisters through fevers since she was 14. She knew what she was doing with a wound. She unwrapped his arm without speaking. The cut was long, but not deep. It had bled a lot, which was probably why it had closed cleanly. She cleaned it with what little she had, rebandaged it properly, and tied off the linen with more force than was strictly necessary. He was watching her while she worked. Not in a way that felt intrusive, more like the way someone watches a thing they're genuinely curious about. "You're good at that," he said. "I've had practice." A pause. Outside wind moved through the pines with a sound like water. "You had to take care of people," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "My mother was sick for a long time. My father—" She stopped, finished tying the bandage. "My father needed someone to hold things together. I was the oldest." Silas was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She sat back, looked at the bandage, decided it would hold. "It taught me things." "What kind of things?" She looked up at him then, because the question surprised her. Not the content of it, but the genuine quality of it. He wasn't making conversation. He was actually asking. That people show you who they are when things get hard, she said, not when things are easy. Anyone can be decent when it doesn't cost them anything. He held her gaze for a moment that went on slightly longer than comfortable. That's true, he said. She looked away first, began gathering the remnants of the bandaging materials. Thank you, he said. Quiet. No performance in it. You'd have gotten an infection, she said, standing up. Then you'd be useless, and I'd have to do everything myself. She went to the wash basin to clean her hands, and behind her she heard the smallest sound, barely a breath really, that might have been a quiet laugh. She found to her own irritation that she didn't entirely hate the sound. Sad. October turned to November and the cold became serious. The kind of cold that made you rethink everything. The efficiency of your woodpile, the draft under your door, the thickness of your blankets, whether you'd put up enough food, whether the things you'd put up were in the right place. Lenora and Silas moved into a rhythm of practicality that had nothing romantic about it and she was finding oddly functional. He did the things she couldn't do and made no issue of it. She did the things that needed doing inside without being asked and made no issue of it either. They negotiated the small space of the cabin without collision because they were both, it turned out, attentive people. The kind of people who noticed where the other person was and moved accordingly. She still slept in the bedroom. He still slept on the floor by the stove. She still didn't entirely trust it, but she was starting, just starting, in the smallest possible way, to let herself wonder if she'd gotten him wrong. Not trust. Not yet. But a question mark where there had only been walls. That was something. In Lenora Ashby's internal economy, that was significant. Outside, the mountains gathered the coming winter to themselves with a heavy, inevitable patience, and the snow began to fall in the kind of way that suggested it had no particular plans to stop. Inside the cabin, a fire burned. A man slept on the floor because he'd promised himself he would wait. A woman lay awake in the warmth he'd given her and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out who he was. Neither of them had any idea how much the winter was about to change. The snow didn't ask permission. It came the way all serious things came to Gray Hollow. Quietly at first, almost politely, and then all at once with a weight and intention that made clear it wasn't leaving any time soon. By the second week of November, the world outside the cabin windows had reduced itself to white and gray and the dark shapes of pine trees bending under the accumulation. And the path between the cabin and the woodpile had become a daily negotiation that left boots soaked and cheeks raw. Lenora had grown up in lower country, where winter was an inconvenience rather than a threat. This was different. She understood that now in her bones, in the specific way you only understand something when your body has registered it directly. She adjusted. She was good at adjusting, had been doing it her whole life. She learned to bank the fire properly before sleeping so the cabin wouldn't be dangerous cold by morning. She learned which floorboard creaked the worst near the door and how to step around it. She learned that the water in the wash basin would have a skin of ice on it before dawn if she didn't keep the bedroom door cracked. And she learned this the hard way on a Tuesday morning when she cracked the ice with her knuckle and sliced herself on the edge of it. Silas wrapped her hand without commentary and handed her a dry cloth. She said, "Thank you." He nodded and went back to lacing his boots. Small moments. That was mostly what they had, the quiet accumulation of small moments that were adding up to something she didn't quite have a name for yet. The rhythm of their days had settled into something functional without ever being discussed. He rose before she did, started the fire, hauled water, was often gone by the time she came out of the bedroom, boots already on and coat already buttoned. She made breakfast for herself and left a portion covered on the back of the stove for whenever he came back, because she'd noticed early on that he rarely thought to eat until it was almost inconvenient not to. He never mentioned it, the covered plate, but it was always empty when she got back to it. She told herself it was pure practicality. A man who collapsed from hunger in a snowstorm was a man she'd have to rescue, and she had enough to manage. She believed this less and less as November wore on. The first real test came on a Wednesday, when two of the settlement's horses broke through the fence of the community paddock in the night and scattered into the tree line. Silas was out before Lenora was fully awake, and when she looked out the frost-edged window, she could see lantern lights moving through the dark at the edge of the settlement. 3, 4 of the men from neighboring cabins, all converging on the paddock without anyone having to send word. They just knew. That was how Gray Hollow worked. When something went wrong, you went. She stood at the window with her coffee, real coffee, which Silas had traded for before the pass closed, one of several things she'd found in the cabin that suggested he'd been paying attention to someone else's potential comfort before she even arrived, and watched the lanterns spread out into the tree line. They came back 4 hours later with both horses, one of them limping. Silas's coat was soaked through, and there was a tear in his trouser knee that hadn't been there before. He came inside, stripped the coat, hung it by the fire, and sat down at the table with the careful movement of someone whose body was voicing complaints. Both horses came back, she said. One of them stepped wrong in a gully. He turned his hands over on the table, looking at them. The cold had made his old scar tissue go pale and tight. Tom Greer's horse. He's worried about it. Is Tom Greer the one with the 3 children and the wife who just had the baby last month? That's him. Lenora thought about this. They can't afford to lose a working horse. No. He flexed his hand slowly. They can't. She refilled her coffee cup and then, after a moment, refilled his too and set it in front of him. He looked at it, then at her, with that expression she was getting to know as the one where he was slightly recalibrating. I'll look at the horse again tomorrow, he said. Might just be bruised through. Hard to tell in the dark. And if it isn't? He was quiet for a moment. We'll figure something out. She didn't ask what that meant. She had a feeling she'd find out, and a feeling it would be another thing he'd handle without ever making it a production. She was right. 2 days later, without any announcement, Silas spent the better part of an afternoon making repairs to Tom Greer's fence with better materials than had been there before. And when Lenora passed the Greer cabin on her way back from Ruth's, she saw Tom standing at his door watching Silas work with an expression she recognized. The look of a man who doesn't know how to receive something without making it awkward, and has decided the only dignified response is to say nothing and feel it privately. She understood that expression completely. She was wearing it herself most days. Ruth had given her more bark tea and a long look that saw too much. You're not as guarded as you were when you got here, Ruth observed, not unkindly. I don't know what you mean, Lenora said. Sure you don't. Ruth refilled her own cup. First 2 weeks, you sat with both hands around that cup like you were protecting it from something. Now you just hold it regular. She settled back in her chair. That's all I'm saying. Lenora had no answer for that. She changed the subject, and Ruth let her, which was one of the things she genuinely liked about the woman. The cold deepened through November and into December, with a seriousness that even the older residents of Gray Hollow noted was something heavier than they let show openly. The Danvers family, 4 cabins up from Lenore and Silas, had put up less food than they needed. Their summer hadn't gone well, a blight on most of their kitchen garden, and an illness that had taken their pig in August. By December, they were working through what they had at a pace that didn't add up to getting through February, let alone March. The settlement knew this the way settlements know things, without anyone having to say it directly. Information traveled in Gray Hollow through glances and pauses, and the careful way people changed the subject when certain names came up. Lenora found out about the Danvers situation from Ruth, who mentioned it in the oblique way people mention things they want you to know without being seen to gossip. She went home and looked at their own stores in the root cellar. The shelves Silas had packed tight before she arrived, before he'd known anything about what kind of woman she was, and did quiet arithmetic in her head. That evening she said to Silas, "The Danvers family." He was cleaning his rifle at the table, a task he performed with a particular focused calm that she'd come to find oddly settling to be around. He didn't look up immediately. "I know," he said. "What are you going to do?" He set the cleaning rod down and looked at her. "What are we going to do?" It wasn't a correction exactly, more of a small, careful adjustment, the kind that wasn't asking for anything in return, just stating a fact about how he saw things. She felt it land somewhere in her chest in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with. "What are we going to do?" she said. "I was thinking about taking some of the salt pork over and the extra flour in the back." He paused. "We have enough. More than enough. I made sure of that. And I thought, before I did it, I'd mention it to you first." She looked at him steadily. "Why? It's your food." He held her gaze with a patience that wasn't passive. There was something active in it, something that was actually paying attention to her. "It's our food," he said simply. "We're a household. I don't make decisions like that without you knowing." The sentence sat there between them, entirely reasonable, entirely matter-of-fact, and somehow one of the stranger things anyone had said to her in recent memory. She was so accustomed to decisions being made around her, in her name, for her supposed benefit, that the simple act of being consulted had become unfamiliar. "Yes," she said, "we should take it over." They went the next morning before the Danvers family was fully up, left the provisions on the covered porch with no note, and walked back through the snow without speaking. The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people have just done something they both feel okay about, and neither one wants to cheapen it by talking. They were almost back to their own cabin when she said, "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "Help people without letting them know it was you." He was quiet for a step or two. The snow under their boots made a particular compressed sound in very cold weather, a creak almost, like a slow door. "People feel better when they don't have to be grateful," he said finally. "Gratitude is hard. It reminds people they needed something. I'd rather they just have what they need." She turned that over in her mind for the rest of the morning. It became a difficult thing to argue with, the more she thought about it. She'd spent years being made to feel grateful for things that should have simply been given. Affection, consideration, the basic courtesy of being asked what she wanted. Gratitude as a transaction. She knew what that felt like from the receiving end. The idea that someone might consider that deliberately before doing a kindness, that was new to her. It rearranged something quietly in her understanding of the man who slept on the floor of his own cabin by choice and asked for nothing back. December moved in with its full weight, and the days shortened until the light was barely more than a gray suggestion from mid-afternoon on. The inside of the cabin took on its own kind of permanence. The smell of wood smoke and venison broth, and the pine sap that oozed slowly from the log walls in the warmth. The particular pattern of shadows cast by the fire on the ceiling above, where Lenora lay some nights, unable to sleep. On one of those nights, she could hear Silas shifting on the floor, not restless exactly, just the natural adjustments of a large man on a hard surface. She'd been listening to those small sounds for weeks now without acknowledging them, in the same way she'd been noticing other things without acknowledging them. She lay in the dark and had a quiet argument with herself. The argument covered familiar ground. She didn't know this man. She didn't know where he came from, or what made him the way he was, or whether the man she'd been watching for 6 weeks was the only version of him that existed. She'd grown up watching her father be charming and reasonable until he wasn't. She'd watched her mother make accommodations for a man's difficult edges until the accommodations were just her life. She knew better than to take a man at face value. She also knew, and this was the uncomfortable part, that she'd been waiting for the moment when Silas would slip, show some edge, make some demand, lose his patience with the situation that was, by any reasonable measure, not easy for him either. She'd been waiting for 6 weeks and the moment hadn't come, and she was starting to have to consider the possibility that the man was simply consistent in a way she wasn't used to. That was scarier in some ways than if he'd just been difficult from the start. Difficult was familiar. Difficult she knew how to manage. This quiet, patient, entirely undemanding presence, she didn't have a system for this. She heard him shift again on the floor below, a muffled sound that might have been him pulling his coat tighter. The temperature at floor level was considerably colder than where she was. She knew this without having to think about it, and she found herself lying in the warmth he'd given up and staring at the ceiling with a specific kind of discomfort that wasn't physical. The hunting season brought its own particular shape to their days. Silas disappeared into the mountains for 2 and 3 days at a stretch, and Lenora managed the cabin in his absence with a competence she hadn't been entirely sure she possessed before coming to Gray Hollow. She discovered that she was better at being alone than she'd thought, or rather, that she was used to being alone even in company, and that actual solitude was in some ways easier. No one to manage, no one's mood to read and adjust for. Just the fire, and the work, and the mountain silence pressing down on the valley outside. She also discovered that she noticed when he came back, not anxiously, she told herself firmly it wasn't anxiety, but in the way you notice when a familiar sound returns after an absence. The particular weight of the door, The cold that came in with him and then receded, the smell of pine and long cold air that clung to his coat. He always brought back meat, more than they needed. The excess went to neighbors without announcement, distributed with such matter-of-fact casualness that it had taken Lenora a while to map the full scope of it. The Calloway family received a portion after Ruth's husband wrenched his back and couldn't tend his traps. Old Caleb Marsh got venison again, packaged neatly at their door before dawn. The Greer family, whose horse had healed but who were still running tight on stores, found meat on their porch twice in December that could not be attributed to anyone specifically. She started keeping track. She wasn't sure why. Force of habit, maybe? The same impulse that had made her track her father's moods, and her mother's medication, and her younger sister's needs. She cataloged what she observed in the private accountant's ledger of her mind, and what she found was this. Silas Boone gave away more than he kept, consistently, without being asked, without recognition, and without apparent need for either. She thought about that for a long time on a night in mid-December when the wind was doing things against the cabin walls that made the whole structure seem smaller than it was, and the fire was burning down to coals because she'd let herself get absorbed in mending a split seam on his second-best coat and lost track of time. She went and added wood to the fire, got the flames going again, and looked at the bedroll on the floor. Empty, because Silas was 3 days into a trapping run. She looked at the floor itself. Hard-packed dirt under the boards, drafty at the lowest levels in the worst cold. She stood there for a while longer than she meant to. Then she went to bed, because she didn't know what else to do with what she was feeling, and thinking about it more didn't seem to be helping. He came back the following evening, a day earlier than expected, with a short explanation about conditions shifting in the upper trail that made the eastern line not worth working. He came in cold and tired and said very little over dinner, which she'd made a double portion of without consciously planning to. He ate with the focus of a man whose body had been running on not quite enough for several days and was only now catching up. She didn't ask about the trip. She could see it in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he moved his left shoulder, which had been bothering him since the arm wound in October. "Your shoulder," she said. "It's fine." "You're holding it differently." He looked at her. That recalibrating look. "It stiffens in the cold. It'll work out. I have some of the salve Ruth gave me. The one with the pine resin and Lenora." "I'm going to get it," she said, and she got it, and he sat at the table and let her work it into the joint without protest, which was its own kind of progress. He sat very still while she worked, and outside the wind was high, and the snow was coming sideways past the window, and the fire popped and settled, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Thank you," he said eventually, into the quiet. She stopped working, hand still on his shoulder, and she wasn't sure what made her say what she said next. Maybe the wind, maybe the smallness of the cabin against the enormous cold outside, maybe the simple fatigue of keeping her guard in a constant state of readiness against something that kept refusing to threaten her. "You're not what I expected," she said. He was very still for a moment, then, "What did you expect?" She considered lying. She was good at lying by omission, had been doing it for years in her father's house. But she was also tired, and the truth was right there, and she was a woman who, when she finally decided to say something, tended to say it. "I expected someone who'd want something in return," she said. "For all of it. The room, everything. I expected it to be a transaction. That's what it was when it started. And I was prepared for that." He was quiet. The fire shifted. She took her hands off his shoulder and stepped back, because suddenly the proximity felt like more than she'd planned for. "I know that," he said finally. "I knew that when you got here. I could see it. And you didn't—" She stopped. "You didn't use it." He turned on the bench so he was looking at her, and his expression was one she hadn't seen from him before. Not complicated, exactly, but deeper than his usual calm. Something in it that had cost something to show. "No," he said. "I didn't use it." She looked back at him for a long moment, this man who slept on floors and left food on porches in the dark and asked for nothing and kept every promise he hadn't even made out loud. She didn't say anything more. She put the lid back on Ruth's salve and set it on the shelf and said goodnight, and went to the bedroom and shut the door and lay there in the dark with her heart doing something irregular that she was going to need several more days, at minimum, to examine honestly. Outside, the winter kept its relentless terms. Inside, something was shifting, not dramatically, not like a door swinging open, but the way ice sometimes behaves at the very edge of thaw. The almost imperceptible molecular reorganization that happens just before everything changes, when the surface still looks solid, but something underneath has already made a decision. She lay in the warmth of the bed he gave her and listened to him settle on the floor on the other side of the wall, and she thought, "I don't know what to do with you, Silas Boone. I genuinely don't know what to do with you." It was not an entirely bad feeling, though she wasn't ready to call it anything else yet. 3 days after the conversation about the salve and the shoulder and the thing she wasn't ready to name yet, the worst storm of the season arrived without much warning. It started as an ordinary snowfall, the kind Gray Hollow had been getting for weeks, steady and manageable, the sort of weather that was inconvenient but not alarming. By midday, it had changed character entirely. The wind came down off the upper peaks with a ferocity that rattled the cabin walls and pushed fingers of cold air through every gap in the chinking, and by early afternoon the visibility outside had dropped to almost nothing. A white wall where the settlement used to be, the nearest neighbor's roofline completely invisible. Lenora stood at the window and watched the woodpile disappear under accumulating snow, and felt, for the first time since arriving in Gray Hollow, genuinely afraid of the weather. Silas came in from securing the small outbuilding where he kept his trapping equipment, kicking snow from his boots at the threshold with the controlled urgency of a man who'd seen this before and knew exactly how serious it was. "We're staying in," he said. Not a suggestion. "I gathered," she said. He moved through the cabin checking things. The fire, the water supply, the food they had accessible without going to the root cellar. She watched him do this and did her own quiet inventory alongside it, the two of them moving through the small space in that parallel way they'd developed, neither getting in the other's path. "How long?" she asked. He looked at the window, at the quality of the light through the blowing white. 2 days at least. Maybe 3. A pause. Could be more. She absorbed this. The Danvers family. Their stove was drawing poorly last time I was there. Ruth mentioned it. "I know. Tom Greer and I looked at it last week. It should hold." He pulled his coat back on. "I'm going to check on Caleb Marsh before this gets any worse. He's alone and his woodpile is on the far side of his cabin. That'll take you close to half an hour in this." "Probably." He was already buttoning. She opened her mouth to say something, she wasn't entirely sure what, and closed it again. Instead, she went to the shelf and brought down the heaviest wool scarf she'd found in the cabin, one she'd never seen him wear because he seemed to have a stubborn relationship with admitting cold affected him. She held it out. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Take it," she said. "Don't be difficult." He took it, and she thought she saw the very edge of something, not quite a smile, but its close relative, as he wrapped it around his neck and went out into the white. He came back 40 minutes later, longer than she'd expected, with ice in his eyebrows and snow packed into every seam of his coat. He'd brought Caleb Marsh with him, the old man shuffling in behind him, looking simultaneously embarrassed and grateful, in that combination particular to people who've been forced to accept help they needed badly. Lenora had the presence of mind not to make a fuss about it. She just got Caleb a chair near the fire and put something hot in his hands, and let him defrost without comment, which was clearly the right call, because some of the shame went out of the old man's shoulders after a few minutes. They spent the afternoon like that, 3 people in a small warm cabin while the storm did its work outside, the conversation moving in the careful, unhurried way of people who have time and no particular place to be. Caleb Marsh, it turned out, had been in Gray Hollow longer than almost anyone, had come through the original settlement as a young man, and had a particular gift for telling stories that were funny and sad at the same time, without seeming to try for either. Lenora listened to him talk and felt the cabin become, for a few hours, something larger than its dimensions. Silas sat across the fire from her and said little, in his way, but she caught him watching Caleb with a quiet warmth that he didn't trouble to hide when he thought no one was paying attention, and she filed this too in the growing ledger she kept of him. Caleb went to sleep in the chair some time after dark, They let him. Silas added wood to the fire, and Lenora made a last check of the stove damper, and they moved around the sleeping old man in companionable silence. And at some point, Lenora realized that this unspectacular domestic quiet, was the most at ease she'd felt in the company of another person in years, possibly longer than that, and the realization sat so strangely in her chest that she had to look at the fire for a while until it settled. Caleb went home the next morning when the storm paused briefly enough to navigate between cabins. The pause didn't last. By noon, the wind was back and the snow was falling in sheets again, and this time it kept on through the night and into the following day without any pretense of letting up. That was when she found him. She'd woken in the deep middle of the second night. No particular reason, just the light sleeper's instinct that something had shifted. The fire had burned down lower than it should have. She could feel the temperature in the cabin had dropped. She pulled on her extra layer and came out of the bedroom and found Silas on the floor. He was awake. She could tell from his breathing, but barely. That particular quality of wakefulness that comes from someone who hasn't properly slept in too long and is running on stubborn momentum rather than actual rest. He was on his side facing the stove, and even in the low light she could see that his color was wrong, a grayish quality to his face that alarmed her. The fire had burned down because he hadn't added wood to it, and he hadn't added wood because he'd been too exhausted to stay sufficiently awake to do it. Silas, she crouched beside him. He turned his head. Fire needs... I'll get the fire. Don't move. She built it back up with quick, efficient hands, the way he'd shown her without explicitly showing her, by doing it repeatedly in her presence until she'd absorbed the method. When the flames were going properly, she turned back to him. He'd pushed himself to sitting, back against the side of the stove, and was looking at her with an expression that was trying to be his usual steady calm and not quite making it. You're exhausted, she said. I'm fine. You nearly let the fire go out. She kept her voice level, not accusatory, just stating the fact. In this cold, Silas, with an old man in the cabin yesterday, and no... She stopped herself. The anger she felt was not straightforward anger, and she understood enough about herself to know she needed to be careful with it. How long haven't you slept properly? He looked away from her. I sleep. You sleep an hour or two at a time on a hard floor, and then you're up checking the fire and listening for whether anything's wrong outside, and then you sleep another hour. She'd heard it. She'd been listening to it from the other side of the wall for weeks, and telling herself she wasn't paying attention. That's not sleep. That's just lying down between worries. He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled and threw orange light across the side of his face. Outside, the storm pushed against the cabin walls with a sound like a sustained low argument. I'm used to it, he said finally. That doesn't make it fine. He looked back at her, and for once there was no recalibration, no careful neutral stillness. He just looked tired. Actually genuinely tired in a way she suspected he'd been concealing with some effort since the storm began. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, this man on the floor of his own house because he decided she deserved the bed, exhausted because he was too stubborn to stop managing everything in the middle of a storm, and she made a decision. Not quickly. She was not a quick decision person, had never been. But the decision was there when she looked for it, complete and fully formed, as if it had been waiting for her to be ready to find it. Get up, she said. He looked at her. I'm not arguing with you, and I'm not asking. Get up. He got up, slowly, with the careful movement of someone whose joints had been on a cold floor too long. She took his arm, not ceremonially, just practically, because he was unsteady on his feet in a way he would never have admitted. And she walked him to the bedroom door. Lenora. The bed is big enough, she said. I told you that 2 months ago. Nothing has changed about the dimensions of the bed. She looked up at him directly and made sure her voice was steady. I'm not doing this because of... It's not anything other than what it is. You need to sleep properly, and you can't do it on the floor, and we're adults, that's all. He looked at her for a long moment. In the low firelight, his eyes were very dark, and whatever he was thinking, she couldn't read it entirely, which was unusual because she'd gotten better at reading him. All right, he said. He was asleep within minutes. She lay on her side of the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to his breathing even out and deepen. and felt the tension in the mattress settle as his body finally released whatever it had been holding against the cold and the exhaustion and the ceaseless quiet effort of keeping everything in order. She didn't sleep for a while, but it wasn't an uncomfortable wakefulness. It was the kind that comes from the mind needing to sit with something important before it can let go. She was almost asleep when she thought, I want to know who he is, the whole of it, where he came from, and what made him this way and what he's afraid of. I want to know. She fell asleep on that thought, and in the morning when she woke, he was already up and the fire was built, and there was coffee, and he didn't look at her with anything other than his usual quiet attention, and she was grateful for that because she needed time to understand what had shifted in herself before she could figure out what to do with it. The storm broke on the third day. In the odd way of extreme weather, the silence after it was almost louder than the storm itself had been. The valley emerged under a weight of snow that changed its proportions, drifts piled against structures to roofline height, paths completely erased, the creek invisible under an unbroken white field. The whole settlement came out slowly, blinking, taking stock. There was damage. A section of the mill roof had collapsed under the load, and the Hendricks family at the far end of the hollow had a tree down on their storage shed. Silas was out helping with both before Lenora had finished clearing their own path to the woodpile. She was stacking recovered wood when Ruth appeared at the edge of the path, bundled to near unrecognizability, cheeks bright red with cold. Everyone all right here? Ruth called. We're fine. You? Fine enough. Ruth picked her way closer, stepping in the boot holes already made in the drifts. She looked at Lenora with that particular attentiveness she had. You look different. I've been stuck inside for 3 days with a fire and no company. Ruth looked toward the tree line where Silas's figure was visible, helping drag timber off the Hendricks shed. You know, I ran into your father before he left in the fall, before the pass closed. Lenora kept stacking wood. Her hands knew what they were doing without her. Did you? He came by to say goodbye. Ruth paused. He said some things. I've been thinking about whether to tell you. Lenora stopped stacking. She turned and looked at Ruth with the direct look she used when she wanted to make clear that she didn't want anything managed or softened. Tell me. Ruth studied her for a moment. Your father felt terrible about what he'd done. You probably know that, but what you might not know is that he went to Silas before the wedding, went to him privately. Ruth pulled her coat tighter. He told Silas he was worried he'd put you in a position you couldn't get out of. He said he'd been a coward, and he knew it. And he wanted Silas to know that if you were unhappy, if you wanted to leave in the spring, he wouldn't hold any of the arrangement against him, that Silas could consider himself free of the obligation. The woodpile, the snow, the sound of men working at the far end of the hollow. Lenora stood with her hands at her sides and let this settle into her understanding. And Silas said, she asked, though she could already feel the shape of it, he told your father that the choice had to be yours. Ruth's voice was careful, not gentle exactly, just precise. He said he wouldn't make any promises to your father about what the marriage would or wouldn't be because those promises weren't your father's to receive. They were yours. He said he'd give you time and space and nothing that wasn't freely offered, and that whatever happened in the spring would be your decision and no one else's. Lenora stood very still. He also said, Ruth continued, that your father shouldn't come back in spring if you didn't want him to. That there was no debt, and you weren't property being loaned out, and he'd never let you feel like you were. She paused. Those were close to his exact words, from what your father told me. Your father cried a little, he said, which I believe because Edmund Ashby always cried at the wrong times and not the right ones. A long silence. The cold settled around Lenora like something physical. He told me none of this, she said. No, he wouldn't. Ruth said it without any particular emphasis, which was somehow more affecting than if she'd made a point of it. That's Silas. He didn't tell you because telling you would have made it about him. Lenora turned away. She looked at the woodpile, at the stacked logs, at the snow-covered valley, and the pale winter sky above the peaks. She was not going to cry in front of Ruth Calloway. She had decided this in advance without knowing she was deciding it. Lenora, Ruth's voice was quieter now. He's not a simple man. But what he is consistent, and out here, consistent is the closest thing to safe there is. She left shortly after, picking her way back through the snow, and Lenora stood by the woodpile alone for several minutes. She thought about what it meant, that Silas had stood in front of her father and said she was not an obligation to be managed, but a person to be waited for. That he'd slept on a cold floor for months, not because he expected it to earn him something, but because he'd made a private promise to himself that the first real choice in this marriage would be hers. That every small kindness, every covered plate, every cord of wood split before dawn had been exactly what it looked like, just kindness, no ledger, no expectation of return. She thought about all the walls she'd built before she got here, the careful management, the held-back trust, the constant low-grade readiness for the moment when the real terms of the arrangement would reveal themselves. She thought about him asleep in the bed last night, finally actually sleeping, his breathing steady and deep, his body at rest in a way it hadn't been in weeks. She thought about Ruth's salve and the cut on her hand, and the water with the ice skin, and the way he always left the warmest spot by the fire, and the thread and needles she hadn't asked for and hadn't acknowledged, and the letter he would never write to her father saying he was handling it. "Don't worry, I've got this. I gave her the room, and I asked nothing, and I waited like I said I would." She picked up the last log and set it on the pile, and it wobbled, and she pushed it straight, and then she stood there with her hand on the rough bark for a moment longer than necessary. The sound of the men at the Hendricks shed had quieted, which meant they'd dealt with it, which meant Silas would be heading back. She looked up and found him already coming across the snowfield toward her, coat dark against the white, moving with that unhurried stride she'd know anywhere now. He raised a hand when he saw her looking. Not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement. "I see you, I'm coming." She raised her hand back. He came up the path and stopped a few feet from her, reading her face with the attentiveness he'd always had, and she knew he could see something was different. He waited without pressing, which was entirely in character. "Ruth told me," she said, "what you said to my father, before the wedding." Something moved in his expression. Not defensiveness, more like the particular careful stillness of a man who isn't sure what's coming and is trying to be fair to it. "She shouldn't have said—" "Don't." Lenora held his gaze. "Don't say she shouldn't have. You've been carrying something that I needed to know, and I needed to know it, and I'm glad she told me." He looked at her. The wind had dropped off after the storm, and the air was cold and clean and entirely still. "I meant what I said to him," Silas said. Quiet. Not defensive, not performed, just true. Every word. "I know." She looked at him steadily. That's what I'm trying to—" She stopped. Started over, because she was not a woman who said imprecise things, and she wasn't about to start. "I've spent my whole life watching people make decisions for me and calling it care. My father, everyone. And I came here ready to fight that. I came here with all my walls up, and I've been waiting for you to prove that you were the same." "I know that too," he said. "You weren't." She said it plainly. "You're not." A beat. "And I don't quite know what to do with that yet. But I wanted you to know that I see it. All of it. Not just the big things, the small things. I see them." The stillness in his face broke, very slightly, into something that wasn't quite a smile but was in that territory. Something that cost something to show, the same thing she'd seen the night before the storm and hadn't been ready for. "Okay," he said. Soft. Just that one word. She nodded once, the way she did when a thing had been said, and there was nothing useful to add, and she went back inside to start something for dinner, and he stood in the snow for another moment before following her in and hanging up his coat and washing his hands at the basin like it was any other day. It wasn't any other day. They both knew that. But this was Gray Hollow, and this was Silas Boone, and the way significant things happened here was not with fanfare. They happened in the space between two people who had stopped pretending the space wasn't there. That night she set the extra blanket on the floor beside the stove, the good wool one folded. And she didn't say anything about it, and he didn't say anything about it either. But when she woke in the early morning hours, cold, sharp, and alert the way the bad weather had trained her to wake, she lay in the dark and listened and heard something that hadn't been there before. The deep, steady breathing of a man who was actually, finally, sleeping without one ear cocked for everything that might go wrong. She closed her eyes. Outside, the valley lay buried and silent under 3 feet of snow. Inside, the fire held, the walls held, and something between them, fragile still and unnamed and real, held too. The blanket stayed on the floor beside the stove. Silas moved back to it after 2 nights without discussion, the same way he'd moved to the bedroom without discussion, because Lenora hadn't asked him to stay and he wasn't going to assume. That was his way, she understood now. He didn't occupy space that hadn't been offered. He waited to be invited into things, and if the invitation didn't come, he found another way to manage and made no issue of it. She watched him carry the bedroll back to its spot by the stove on the 3rd morning after the storm, and she felt something sharp and complicated that she didn't examine too carefully. Not yet. There was still too much she needed to sort through before she could be honest with herself about all of it. What she could be honest about was this. Something had cracked open after Ruth's words in the snow, and the cold air that came through the crack was not the kind she'd been bracing for. It wasn't the cold of disappointment or exposure or the particular chill of finding out a person was smaller than you'd hoped. It was something else entirely, something she'd have to sit with for a while longer before she could name it without flinching. January came in hard and flat, the kind of cold that made the world feel reduced to its absolute essentials. You burned wood, you ate, you kept the animals alive, you slept, you did it again. The luxury of complicated interior weather was something Gray Hollow's winters didn't really accommodate, which Lenora was starting to think might be the valley's most underrated feature. The conversation started in January, not the careful managed exchanges they'd been having since October, the functional communication of 2 people running a household together. Real conversations, the kind that happened when you'd run out of things to avoid, and the fire was low and the snow outside was so deep and so complete that there was nowhere to be except exactly where you were. It started one night over a pot of beans that had been cooking since morning and a loaf of bread that hadn't risen quite right and had a dense, slightly gummy quality that Silas ate without comment, which she appreciated. "Tell me something about where you're from," she said. Not a demand, just putting it out there, the way you put a cup of coffee in front of someone. "Here, if you want it." He looked at the bread, took another bite. She watched him decide something. "Virginia," he said, "the western part. Hill country. Not so different from this." A pause. "I left when I was 19. "Why?" Another pause. Longer this time. He had a way of pausing that wasn't evasion, more like he was selecting the right words from a larger pile of words and didn't want to hand her the wrong ones. "My father had a particular way of doing things," he said, "and I had a particular way of not being able to watch it anymore." He looked at the fire. "My mother, she stayed. She always stayed. I used to be angry at her for that. I spent a long time being angry at her for it." Lenora kept very still. She understood, in the way you understand things that have happened to you in different shapes, what he was describing without describing. "And now?" she asked. "Now I think she did the best she could with what she had available to her." His voice was even. "Which isn't the same as saying it was right, but it's different from being angry." He looked at her briefly, then back at the fire. "It took me a long time to get to different." She thought about her own mother, the accommodations, the quiet adjustments, the woman who had slowly made herself smaller to fit the space her husband's limitations allowed. She'd been angry at her mother, too, in the private way daughters are angry at mothers who don't fight. And then her mother had gotten sick, and the anger had collapsed into something more complicated than anger, and she was still, at 20 years old, somewhere in the middle of sorting through the remains. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "In Gray Hollow." 6 years. He ate more bread without apparent suffering. Came through trapping. Stayed because, he considered. It felt like a place that worked on honest terms. People here don't have the resources to be dishonest. You can't afford to be something you're not when a bad winter can kill you. That's a dark way to recommend a place. It's an honest way. And then, almost before she registered it was happening, one side of his mouth moved. A real thing. Not the almost smile she'd been cataloging, but an actual brief flash of something warm and slightly crooked. "The hunting's also good." She laughed. It came out before she could manage it, shorter and more genuine than she'd planned, and she saw him register it. The way his eyes shifted and held for just a second, the way a man looks at something unexpected that he finds he very much wants to see again. She looked at her bowl, cleared her throat slightly. "Where did you go?" she said. "After Virginia." And he told her. Not everything. She understood there were rooms in him that had been closed for a long time and weren't going to open in a single conversation over bad bread in January. But he talked more than she'd heard him talk about himself in 3 months combined, and she listened with the focused quality she'd always had, the one her mother used to say was unsettling because it made you feel like the only person in the room. He'd gone west first, worked lumber, worked farms, worked the kind of jobs that exist at the edges of places for men without histories they want to explain. He'd learned trapping from an older man in Tennessee who'd taken him on for a season and taught him more about patience and reading landscape than he'd learned in the previous 19 years combined. He'd spent 2 winters alone in mountains he declined to name, which Lenora filed as something she'd ask about another time. He'd come east again, following trap lines in good country, and eventually landed in Gray Hollow, and the valley had done what it apparently did to certain people. Held them. "Did you ever want to go back?" she asked. He thought about this. "To Virginia?" "To any of it. The West. The other places." "No." Simple and immediate. "I'm not built for the going. Some people are. I'm not." He paused. "Once I find a place that feels like it's mine, I stay. I put my work into it." He looked at the table, the cabin, without making a production of the gesture. "This is mine. Gray Hollow. This valley. A beat. This life." She heard what he didn't add to the end of that sentence. She heard the absence of it, the thing he didn't say because he wasn't going to say it until she was ready for it, which she hadn't been and maybe was getting closer to being and couldn't quite commit to yet. She let the silence run for a moment. "Tell me more about the man who taught you to trap," she said. And he did. February was different from January the way the second half of a hard thing is different from the first. You know what you're dealing with now, and that knowledge doesn't make it easier exactly, but it changes the texture of it. The fear is different when it's familiar fear. You can work around it. You know its shape. She and Silas knew each other's shapes now. Not completely. There was still the room in him she hadn't seen. Still things he held back with a care that wasn't secrecy, but genuine privacy. The kind that belongs to a person and doesn't have to be surrendered just because they share a roof. She respected that. She had rooms of her own, but the daily landscape of the cabin had changed. They talked more, and the silences that remained were different silences. Companionable rather than careful, the gaps that exist between people who have enough established between them that they don't need to fill every moment with proof of it. She noticed she'd stopped steeling herself every morning. The low-grade preparedness she'd carried since the wagon ride, the readiness for the other shoe to drop, for the real version of this man to surface and be what she'd expected, had been quietly losing tension for weeks, like a rope you stop pulling because you've realized nothing is on the other end of it. This realization didn't arrive in a single moment. It assembled itself piece by piece over February, over shared meals and the particular way he'd started leaving her coffee cup already filled in the mornings, and the afternoon she'd come in from clearing snow to find him reading by the fire with his boots off and his feet up on the stove rail, completely unguarded in the way people only are when they feel genuinely at ease. And the thing that struck her about it was that she felt the same in his presence, genuinely at ease, without having to manage anything. She sat down across from him with her own book. She'd borrowed it from Ruth, a thick, worn novel with a cracked spine, and read while the fire burned and the snow fell outside. And after about 20 minutes, he said, without looking up from his own pages, "You keep sighing." "I do not." "About every 10 minutes. It's not a complaint, it's—" He glanced up briefly. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. The book is annoying me." "What's wrong with it?" "The woman makes bad decisions, and the author seems to think this is charming." A pause. She could see him processing this. What kind of bad decisions? She keeps giving chances to a man who has shown her repeatedly who he is. She turned a page. And he's not good. She just decides he might be different this time, and then he isn't, and she's surprised, and then she does it again. Silas was quiet for a moment. Maybe she doesn't have many choices, he said, without weight, just offering it. She has more than she thinks, Lenora said. She always did. She learned early that her choices weren't real, and she never unlearned it. She felt him looking at her rather than at his book, and she kept her eyes on the page in front of her, because she'd said more than she'd strictly planned to say about the book, and they both knew it. I think, he said carefully, that's one of the harder things to unlearn. Yes, she said, it is. She turned another page and he went back to reading, and the fire burned down another inch, and outside the snow continued its patient occupation of the valley, and she sat with the understanding of what she'd just said, and what he'd just said, and what was being said beneath all of it. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was the specific discomfort of truth being allowed into a space that's been closed for a long time, and she thought, good, let it in. It was Ruth, inevitably, who said the thing out loud that no one had said out loud. She came by one afternoon in mid-February with a legitimate reason, returning a pot she'd borrowed in December, and stayed 2 cups of tea longer than the pot required. Silas was out. The 2 women sat by the fire, and Lenora let herself relax in the specific way she could with Ruth, which was less defended than with most people. You're happier, Ruth said. Lenora looked at her tea. I'm managing well. That's not what I said. I said happier. Ruth settled her considerable self more firmly in the chair. Don't argue with my vocabulary. I'm not going to have this conversation. You don't have to. I'll have it at you, and you can stare at your tea. Ruth poured herself more from the pot on the stove. I've known Silas Boone for 6 years. In 6 years, I've never seen him look at anything the way he looks at you. Ruth, and I've never seen you. And I'll admit I've only known you 4 months, but I'm a quick study. I've never seen you just sit in a room. You're always doing something, managing something, running some kind of accounting in your head. You just sat. When you didn't know I was watching, you just sat by that fire and looked at the wall and weren't worried about anything. Lenora kept her eyes on her cup. That's him, Ruth said, simply. Whatever that feeling is, that's the house he built around you. And you built one around him too. You just haven't admitted it yet. The silence stretched. I don't know how to do this, Lenora said finally. Quiet. Honest in the way she could be with Ruth that she couldn't be with most people. I know how to manage things. I know how to survive things. I didn't come here knowing how to... She stopped, looked for the right word. Choose something for myself, without it being a response to something else. Ruth nodded slowly. I know. What if I choose wrong? You already know it isn't wrong. Ruth said it gently, but without hedging. That's not what you're afraid of. Lenora looked at the fire. What am I afraid of? That if you trust it, something will take it away. Ruth stood, began putting on her coat. That's the oldest fear there is, honey. Everybody's got it. The only thing that ever beats it is deciding the thing you'd lose is worth risking losing. She left. Lenora sat with the fire and the empty cabin and Ruth's words moving through her like cold water, clarifying, uncomfortable, entirely accurate. She was still sitting there when Silas came back. He came through the door, checked himself when he saw her expression, and had the sense to say nothing immediately, just hung his coat and went to wash his hands and gave her the space of ordinary movement to come back to herself. She watched him at the basin, his back to her. The way his shoulder had healed well enough over the winter, not perfectly. She'd noticed it still stiffened in very deep cold, but well enough. The patched elbow of his good coat. Silas. He turned. She stood up from the chair. She wasn't sure exactly what she'd planned to say. The speech she'd been partially composing in her head since Ruth left was dissolving now that she was actually in the moment of it, which was probably right because the prepared version had been too neat anyway. I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. He leaned against the basin and crossed his arms and waited, which was the correct response. When I came here, I didn't think... She started, stopped, tried again. I told myself that surviving this was the goal, just getting through it. Not trusting anything, not expecting anything, just waiting for the spring pass to open and seeing what happened. She looked at him. And then you were consistently you for 4 months. And I kept waiting for it to change, and it didn't change. And I've had to face the fact that I've been protecting myself from something that isn't actually a threat. He didn't say anything. His expression was very careful. Not closed, just careful, like a man trying hard not to influence the outcome of something by reacting too soon. I'm not good at this, she said. I want to be clear about that. I don't know how to do this without being... I have a lot of habits that aren't going to go away overnight. I'm going to second-guess things. I'm probably going to pick fights about things that have nothing to do with what I'm actually upset about, because that's what I do when I'm scared. I'm telling you this up front because... She took a breath. Because I think you deserve to know what you'd actually be dealing with, not the version I can keep together when I'm trying. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had changed, slowly, while she was talking. The careful neutrality giving way to something that was not careful at all. Something that had been waiting a long time for something like this, and was not entirely sure what to do with it now that it was here. "Lenora," he said. His voice was not entirely steady, which was the first time she'd ever heard that. "I'm not finished." He pressed his lips together, waited. "I'm choosing this," she said. I'm choosing you. Not because it's winter and I'm stuck and there's no alternative, because you are..." She looked for the right word and found one that was plain enough to be true. "Because you are the most decent person I have ever shared space with, and because you made me feel like my choices were real when I'd stopped believing they were, and because I don't want to wait until spring to decide something I've already decided." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need filling. He crossed the cabin in a few steps, and he didn't do anything dramatic, didn't pull her into anything, didn't make it a gesture. He just took her face in both hands the way you hold something you've been careful with for a long time and looked at her, close and direct. "Okay," he said. The same word he'd said in the snow after the storm, the same soft delivery, and she understood now that for him this word carried the entire weight of everything he didn't have the architecture to say in more complicated language. "Okay, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "I know," she said. He kissed her once, not complicated about it, and she let herself lean into it without managing it, without bracing or calculating or keeping any part of herself in reserve, and it was not perfect. She bumped his nose slightly and they both paused and she laughed, and he made that sound again, the quiet one from the very beginning that she'd told herself she didn't like and had never stopped noticing. And then she stopped laughing, and he did it again properly, and it was the kind of moment that is not graceful, but is entirely real, which is the only kind that matters. Later they sat by the fire, not on opposite sides of it, but on the same side, and he told her more about the 2 winters alone in the unnamed mountains, and she told him more about her mother and the 4 years she'd spent running her father's household, like a woman 3 times her age. And some of it was heavy, and some of it was funny, in the grim, specific way that hard things sometimes are when you've gotten enough distance from them, and neither of them performed any of it. He was not a man who suddenly became easy to know just because she'd decided to know him. She understood that. There were still things he held that he'd need time to offer, and there were things in her that would take longer to soften than a single honest conversation. She was not going to wake up different. He was not suddenly going to talk twice as much. But he held her hand in the firelight in a way that felt like something he'd been saving, and she let him, and outside the mountains held the winter in place over the valley, and the stars came out hard and cold in a sky that went on forever, and inside the cabin it was warm and the fire needed another log. But neither of them moved to get it yet, and it was imperfect and ongoing and entirely, completely theirs. The log that neither of them had moved to get that night in February eventually got put on the fire. That was the thing about real life. It didn't hold its meaningful moments suspended indefinitely. At some point, the cold reasserted itself, and someone got up and dealt with it. And then there was the question of dinner, and the morning came with its ordinary requirements, and the extraordinary thing that had happened between them had to find a way to exist inside the ordinary, which is always the harder task. They were not suddenly uncomplicated. Lenora had warned him of this, and she'd been right to. There was a week in late February where she picked a fight with him about the way he stored the trapping equipment in the outbuilding. Too crowded, she said. Inefficient. A hazard if he needed something quickly in bad conditions. And she was not entirely wrong about the storage, but she was mostly angry about something else. Something interior that she couldn't fully name yet. The fear that Ruth had identified pressing against the inside of her chest in the small hours when everything felt more exposed than it did in daylight. She knew this about herself while it was happening, which did not stop it from happening, which was its own frustrating education. Silas took the criticism about the outbuilding without particular defensiveness, said he'd look at it, and then on the third day of her being difficult, said quietly, over breakfast, "Whatever is actually bothering you, I'm here when you want to say it." She looked at him across the table. "I know it's not the outbuilding," he said. She put down her fork. "I'm scared," she said, plain, like ripping something off quickly. "I've decided to trust something, and that means there's now something to lose, and I'm not good at having things to lose." He nodded slowly. "I know. It doesn't make the fights fair." "No." He picked up his coffee. "But I'd rather have the fights than have you lock it back up." He looked at her steadily. "Don't lock it back up," she breathed out. "I'll try." "That's enough," he said. It was not the last difficult week. There were others smaller as February ended and March began and the winter started showing the first signs of its eventual reluctant retreat. But they were survivable in a way that previous difficult things in her life had not been, because the ground under them was different now. There was something solid they were both standing on. You can have a hard conversation when you trust the floor. March came in with the particular cruel optimism of early thaw. A few days that felt almost like spring, the kind that lured you outside without your heaviest coat and then turned around and delivered another week of deep cold, as if to remind you that winter in Gray Hollow was not a thing that left just because you wanted it to. The old-timers called it the false spring and didn't trust it, and Lenora understood now why. The mountains ran on their own schedule. The only winning move was patience. It was in the third week of March, during one of the genuine thaw days when the snow was actually retreating from the south-facing slopes and the creek could be heard running again under the thinning ice, that Edmund Ashby came back. Lenora heard the horse before she saw it. She was in the yard splitting kindling, a task she'd taken over from Silas in January, and found she had a particular aptitude for, the satisfying crack of the wood and the clean physical work of it. And the sound of a horse coming down the valley road made her look up. She recognized her father's horse before she recognized him. He'd lost weight over the winter. His coat was road-worn, and he sat in the saddle with the careful posture of a man whose lower back had been complaining since the second day of riding. He saw her and slowed, and they looked at each other across the distance, and the feelings that moved through Lenora in that moment were too many and too layered to sort through quickly, so she set down the axe and waited. He dismounted at the gate. He took off his hat. He looked at her with an expression that had clearly been rehearsed and was now, in the actual moment of execution, falling apart at the seams. "Lenora," he said. "Papa." A silence that had months of weight in it. "You look well," he said. "I am well." She held the gate open for him. "Come inside, you look cold and hungry." He was both. She fed him without making him ask for it, and he ate with the humility of a man who has spent months with something on his conscience and has arrived at the destination of his guilt without being entirely sure what kind of welcome to expect. Silas came in from the tree line an hour later, read the situation in one glance the way he read most things, and shook Edmund's hand without ceremony and said he'd check on the back fence line before dinner, and was gone again with a tact that Lenora noticed and appreciated without acknowledgement. Her father watched Silas leave and then looked at the cabin. At the order of it, the warmth, the evidence of two people living a real life inside it, with the careful look of someone taking inventory of their own actions and finding the accounting more complicated than expected. "He's a good man," Edmund said, not performatively, just acknowledging something he could see plainly. "Yes," Lenora said, "he is. I didn't know if—" He stopped, turned his hat in his hands. "When I made the arrangement, I told myself I knew what kind of man he was. But I didn't really know. I hoped." He looked at her. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. It isn't. I'm sorry, Lenora. He said it directly, without the softening he usually applied to his apologies. I made a decision about your life without your consent. I told myself it was for the family, for your sisters, and it was for those things. But I also could have found another way if I'd been braver or more resourceful, and I wasn't, and I chose the path that cost you most. He paused. There isn't a clean way to say that. She looked at her father, this man who had always been better at meaning well than at doing well, who had loved his family in a way that was genuine and insufficient in roughly equal measure, who had made a choice she hadn't forgiven and probably wouldn't entirely forgive because forgiveness wasn't the same as acceptance, and she didn't need to perform the first to practice the second. I know why you did it, she said, quietly. I've known since the wagon ride. I'm not going to tell you it was right, because it wasn't. She held his gaze. But I'm going to tell you that I'm all right. I am genuinely, actually all right. Not because everything worked out conveniently, because I made it work, because of choices I made, and because of the person he turned out to be. She paused. You don't get to take credit for that. Edmund Ashby absorbed this. He looked like a man who had walked a long way and arrived at something harder than he'd hoped for and truer than he deserved. No, he said. I don't. Are my sisters well? Something in his face shifted into easier territory. Clara shot up 2 inches since fall. She's going to be taller than you. Margaret is learning to read and considers herself the greatest scholar of her generation. He almost smiled. The youngest 2 are a disaster, as usual. Lenora felt something loosen in her chest, the particular ache of missing people you love who are far away, which she'd been managing by not touching it directly. Good, she said. That's good. Silas came back for dinner, and the 3 of them ate together with the careful good manners of people navigating complicated emotional terrain in a small space. Edmund tried, Lenore noticed, and Silas was decent to him in the particular way of a man who has made a private decision about how he's going to treat someone and is sticking to it regardless of his own feelings on the matter, which she suspected were layered. He'd told her in February about the conversation before the wedding, offered it himself without her asking, said he'd been thinking she should hear it from him rather than anyone else. He'd been matter-of-fact about it. He didn't expect her father to be different than he was. He just expected to be different himself. Edmund stayed 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd, when he was saddling his horse, Lenora stood with him in the cold, clear air of an early spring morning, and they said the things that needed to be said more plainly than they'd managed over dinner. I don't need you to feel better about it, she told him. I need you to be honest with Clara and Margaret about how things work. When they're old enough, I need them to know they have choices, even when it doesn't feel like it. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll do that, he said. And then, you're more yourself than I've ever seen you. She thought about that. I think, she said slowly, I've had room to be. He rode out at mid-morning, up the road toward the pass that was just barely negotiable, the snow retreating day by day from the higher trail. She watched him go and felt the feeling she'd expected. The complicated composite of old grief and residual anger and genuine affection that was probably as resolved as it was going to get, which was not perfectly resolved, and was enough. Silas came to stand beside her when the horse had disappeared around the bend. You okay? He asked. Yes, she considered. He's still who he is. I'm still who I am. The difference is, I know the difference now. She glanced at him. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense. They stood in the cold morning air for another moment, and then she said, Let's get the south fence fixed today. I heard it creaking last week, and I don't want to find out what happens if it goes in mud season. I looked at it yesterday, he said. 2 posts need replacing. I've got the timber. Of course he had the timber. She shook her head, not with exasperation, but with something that was its opposite. The particular warm feeling of knowing someone's habits well enough to predict them. Let's go then, she said. Spring came to Gray Hollow the way it always did. Not all at once, but in negotiations, a few degrees at a time, the snow pulling back from the south slopes while the north-facing hollows held their white a few weeks longer. The mud season was absolute and unforgiving, requiring a kind of philosophical acceptance that Lenora had not previously known she possessed. Everything got muddy. There was no solution. You just waited it out and washed things when it was over. The settlement came back to itself in spring with an energy that had been compressed all winter, people emerging from their cabins with a slightly dazed quality, like waking from a long dream. There was work everywhere, roofs to repair, fences to reset after the frost heave, fields to turn as soon as the ground allowed. Grey Hollow's version of spring was not restful. It was deferred work arriving all at once. The second week of April, Ruth organized what she called a community gathering, which Grey Hollow had apparently done every spring, and which was less a formal event than an excuse for everyone to occupy the same outdoor space at the same time and verify that they'd all survived the winter. People brought food that was simple and plentiful, someone produced a fiddle, and the Hollow filled for one afternoon with the particular quality of collective relief that comes from having made it through something hard together. It was at this gathering that the community, for the first time, saw Lenora and Silas together as what they actually were. She hadn't thought about how it would look from the outside. She'd been too occupied with the interior of it, but she was aware at some point during the afternoon that people were noticing. The easy way Silas's hand rested at the small of her back when they stood together in conversation. The way she looked at him when he was talking to Tom Greer across the yard. The absence of the careful management she'd been performing since she arrived. The performed self-sufficiency that had been her armor and that she no longer needed to wear quite so heavily. Ruth appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of something slightly fermented that she described as apple cider with ambitions. "Well," Ruth said, with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. She said nothing else. The word contained everything. "Don't," Lenora said. "I'm just standing here." "You're smug." "I'm pleased," Ruth corrected gently. "Different thing." She looked across the yard at Silas, who was now helping the Danvers children with something that involved a piece of rope and considerable disagreement about the rules. "Has he told you about the name yet?" Lenora looked at her. "What name?" Ruth's expression did something complicated. "Never mind. Ask him yourself." She asked him on the walk home, when the afternoon light was going golden across the still patchy snow on the upper slopes, and their boots were picking up mud on the road in the way that would need to be dealt with before entering the cabin. "Ruth said something about a name, said to ask you." He was quiet for 2 steps. "Ruth talks too much." "Ruth talks exactly the right amount." "What name?" He looked at the road. She waited him out. She was good at that now, had learned his particular timing. "When I came to Grey Hollow," he said, "my name wasn't Boone. Boone was my mother's family name. I took it when I came through here because," a pause, "the name I was born with belonged to my father, and I didn't want to carry his name into a place I was trying to build something real in." Lenora thought about this carefully. A man who'd remade himself at the edge of a new place, who'd walked away from the name he was given and chosen one that felt like his own, who understood, from that decision forward, that who you were was not fixed by who you'd been handed to. "What was the name you were born with?" she asked. He told her. She repeated it once, feeling the shape of it. "Boone suits you better," she said. He glanced at her. "You think?" "Boone is who you are." She stepped around a particularly deep mud section in the road. "The other name is someone else's story." He was quiet for another moment, then, "I thought about telling you earlier, before the wedding even, but I didn't know how to explain it without it sounding like I was hiding something." "Were you hiding it?" "No, I don't lead with it. It's not the most important thing about who I am." He looked at her. "But it is a thing." "I know," she said, "and now I know it, and it doesn't change anything, and we can move on." He exhaled slowly. "That's simple." "That's simple," she paused. "Although Ruth knowing before me is something I'll be bringing up at an inconvenient moment in the future, just so you're aware." He made the sound, the quiet one, the one she had long since stopped pretending she didn't love. The spring gathering at Ruth's had included, without anyone planning it that way, something that functioned as a public acknowledgement of the Boones as a unit, as a household that had formed itself into something real. No ceremony, no speeches, Just two people standing in the same yard with the same ease, receiving the community's matter-of-fact acceptance in the undemonstrative way of people who don't need a lot of ceremony to know what they have. What they hadn't planned for, what neither of them knew yet on that April afternoon walking home through the mud, was the news that would arrive 6 weeks later when the full warmth of May had finally settled into the valley, and the trees were doing the thing they did in spring, that urgent green that seemed almost aggressive after the long white, the news that would change the dimensions of their life and their cabin and their future in ways neither of them had mapped yet. Lenora found out on a Tuesday. She sat with the knowledge for a day before she told him, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she needed one day to let it be just hers before it became theirs, which was a distinction she was allowed to make and that she knew, without any doubt, Silas would understand. She told him on a Wednesday evening after dinner with the bluntness she applied to all important things. He went very still. Not the cautious, careful stillness she'd learned in October, but a different stillness, something that was working to contain something much larger than stillness. He said, how are you feeling? Uncertain, she said, which is different from bad. He nodded, processing. Silas, he looked at her. Say what you're actually feeling, she said. Don't manage it, just say it. He put down the cup he'd been holding and ran a hand over his face in the gesture she'd come to recognize as him buying himself a moment. Terrified, he said. And he stopped, shook his head, and the thing that had been working to contain itself moved across his face openly, fully, without the careful regulation he usually applied. And there isn't a word that's large enough for the other part. She reached across the table and took his hand, which she did now without thinking, without cataloging it as a choice, because it had become simply what she did when she wanted to hold his hand. We'll figure it out, she said. He turned his hand over and held hers properly. We will, he said. It was not a small thing, what they were facing. A child born in Gray Hollow was born into a life that demanded everything, demanded that its parents be capable and consistent and present in ways that exhausted lesser people. She knew this. She'd watched the Greer family, the Danvers family, Ruth's own grown children who'd since scattered to other valleys. She had no illusions about what it meant, but she also had a cabin with solid walls and a woodpile that was never low, and a man who fixed things before they broke and shared food without being asked and slept on hard floors for months because he'd made a private promise to someone who didn't know he'd made it. Whatever she'd expected when the wagon rode into Gray Hollow in October, this was not it. This specific life. Not easy, not completed, not without its bad weeks and its unsaid things and its ongoing negotiations with the mountains and the cold and the particular difficulty of two imperfect people making a home together. This was not something she'd let herself imagine. She was grateful she hadn't. Imagining it would have made it smaller than it turned out to be. The baby arrived in December, which felt, to those in the hollow who noticed patterns, like something deliberate. The anniversary of the hardest winter, the season that had forced two strangers into the same small space and refused to let either of them be anything other than exactly who they were. Ruth delivered the baby with the competence of a woman who had done this many times and considered excessive drama to be counterproductive. And afterward, when the cabin had quieted and Ruth had gone home, Silas sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and looked at the small red-faced fact of his daughter with an expression that Lenora would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. Something so far beyond his usual reserve that she could see straight through to the center of him, to the man who had left Virginia at 19 to get away from a kind of life and had spent 15 years quietly building toward a different kind, one careful act at a time, alone. Not alone anymore. She has your determination already, he said softly. Look at that expression. She's 20 minutes old. I know what I see. Lenora looked at her daughter and felt the particular vertigo of understanding that you are now responsible for a person who did not choose you and will spend years deciding what to make of you, which is both terrifying and honest, and the most real thing she had ever been asked to do. We're going to make mistakes, she said. Yes. Things we don't anticipate, things we handle wrong. Yes. He looked up at her, and we'll deal with them. You sound very certain. I'm not certain about anything, he said. but I'm certain about the dealing with it part. She believed him. Not blindly. She'd never done anything blindly in her life, and she wasn't planning to start. But she'd watched this man for 14 months in the specific laboratory conditions of a hard winter in a small cabin, under conditions that showed you exactly who a person was when the comfortable options ran out, and what she'd seen, consistently, without exception, was this. He showed up. He stayed. He did what needed doing and asked for nothing back and held the line on every private promise he'd made, whether anyone was watching or not. She knew that this was not the whole of him, that he had his own room she was still learning, his own difficult territory she'd mapped only partially, his own way of going silent when something was too large and needing to be reminded that she was there and could hold it with him. She knew they were not finished people who had found a finished arrangement. They were ongoing works in progress, sharing a small cabin and a daughter and a life in a mountain valley that would continue to demand everything they had. That was the truth of it, not the version where the struggle was the pathway to a perfect peace, just the actual ongoing thing with all its incomplete edges. Outside, the December snow was falling again on Gray Hollow. The same snow, more or less, that had fallen when she arrived. The snow that had trapped her here and stripped away every plan she'd made and forced her to see that surviving wasn't the same as living, and that the difference between the two was, specifically, the willingness to trust someone enough to let them matter. The fire held, the walls held. The child sleeping in the crook of her arm was warm and entirely unimpressed with the significance of her own arrival, which seemed right. Silas put another log on the fire, unhurried, the way he did everything. He came back and sat beside her, and she leaned against him, which she did now without thinking, which was itself the whole story. The fact of its being ordinary, unremarkable, simply what she did. The snow fell on Gray Hollow, on the woodpiles and the rooftops, and the dark water of the creek, and the road that wound up to the pass, and on the world beyond the pass that had released her into this valley, and then closed behind her, and had been the best thing it ever did. She closed her eyes. The fire breathed, the baby breathed. The man beside her breathed, steady and present and entirely, simply there. That was enough. That was, she understood now, what enough actually felt like. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something worth the difficulty, standing solid in the middle of it and choosing it again every ordinary day.